Welcome to week 3. This week you will embark upon your first milestone project. If you have not had an opportunity to review the Building Strategic Compensation Systems project e-text in its entirety, and if you have not reviewed the rubrics, so the grading rubrics, for each of the milestones leading up to the final project, including the final project rubric, I would highly encourage you to do so. It's important to understand what the end result of this real world simulation is, and that is you are a consultant. So congratulations, you've been hired. You're a consultant. And a fictitious company named Sonic Records has identified that their market is shrinking. And in order to remain relevant in the music business, they have decided to create a subsidiary called eSonic. And you can find a slew of background information about Sonic Records and eSonic in the introduction of the Building Strategic Compensation Systems project, which starts on page 5 of that e-text. And the purpose of this background is to ensure that you get an idea of what the company's strategic objectives are, because your role as a consultant is to ensure that you understand the business, you know the market, you know the strengths and the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats, the political environment, the technical environment, the economic environment, and the social environment that all influence this particular business model. And when you have all of that information, which is really what you're going to be gathering for this Milestone 1 project, it's a complete strategic analysis. Once you have that information as a consultant, you can begin to think about what you need to do to build a strategic compensation system designed to mitigate any risks and to maximize the company's objectives. And so with this particular presentation, what I'd like to do is kind of walk you through the strategic analysis piece, and to ensure that everyone is clear that in order to be at an exemplary level for this particular assignment, it will require research into this industry. It will require research into the competition. It will require you to identify scholarly sources. And so let me talk about that for just one moment. One of the things that students tend to gravitate to are things like blogs or Twitter or Wikipedia or Facebook. And while those sources can help spark an idea, as we've learned over the last several years, there's not a whole lot of fact checking that go on in these kind of mediums. And so what I want to see from all of you in this particular assignment is a shift away from what we would call the fun type of resources and move towards scholarly resources. Now, a scholarly source is one that is peer-reviewed. You'll find them in trade publications, journals. There is research that is conducted to assist. And these are the types of sources that will help make your arguments more credible. Now, in the absence of journal articles, you can also focus on some of the more traditional sources of information. Things like newspapers, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, those types of news organizations. You can focus on Time Magazine, Forbes, Business Week, The Economist, Things like that will help you, or I should say magazines, publications that are industry specific will carry more weight than, for example, Julie's blog. Um, while again, that information can help spark you, it's not always fact checked. And I can give you an example of a student in the past who utilized a blog to talk about healthcare and specifically healthcare reform. And what the student didn't realize, because the student isn't a part of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and all of the reporting requirements that surround it, what that student didn't realize was that the information in the blog was over 10 years old, and much of the regulations had changed since the initial passing of the legislation. That person wouldn't have known that. I do. I deal with that every day. And so it doesn't lend to the credibility of the argument, which that student was trying to make, when it can be discounted. And so this is why I hone in on scholarly sources. You've heard me specifically address that in your discussion question posts, both your initial and your peer posts. It's important that we get into the habit of using other resources outside of the text and outside of these unfact-checked sources to make our points, more valid. And so when you move into this milestone, I cannot stress enough how important it will be to do your research. I will expect citations within the text and a reference page. So please be sure, if you're uncertain how to cite with APA guidelines, that you take a look at the Writing Center, specifically in the area of APA citations. If you have questions, you can ask me. I often will pop open the resource myself whenever I'm unclear. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a strategic analysis. So if you want to follow along with your Building Strategic Compensation Systems project e-text, we're going to jump into the strategic analysis section, which begins on page 9. I'm not going to necessarily at this point go through step by step, but I am going to walk you through this particular presentation that I found that is available on SlideShare, that I found was very informative. And so let's talk about what we do as consultants in this particular process. And the first is to really understand the situation. So you do a situational analysis, which is what that introduction is about. That's your situational analysis. That's where the company is. That's what they want to do. And in order to get into this situation, we've got to look internally and externally, which is where your Milestone 1 project comes into place. And to do that, you're going to look at your strengths, your weaknesses, the opportunities and threats of this particular company. You do your own. So as a consultant, each one of you is putting on the hat of the Sonic Records eSonic situation, and you're putting on that hat, and you're going to conduct strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Only you will be able to know what that is based on your research. So, understanding the environment in which an organization is operating, together with an understanding of the organization's interaction with its environment in order to improve efficiency and effectiveness by increasing the organization's capacity to deploy and redeploy its resources intelligently. That's the definition of a strategic analysis. In other words, what this means is you got to know what the environment is that you're operating in. You've got to know how you operate within that environment so that you can improve your internal efficiency, which is important from a bottom line profitability perspective. But you also have to increase the ability to use your resources intelligently. And so when you're completing a strategic analysis, there's two components to that. One, you have to know the industry and the competitive conditions. And the second is that you've got to have the company's own competitive capabilities, resources, strengths, weaknesses, and market position. You've got to also know those as well. By doing that, you can create a winning strategy. Otherwise, if you're not familiar enough with the environment, the company is going to lose its competitive advantage and the performance will be affected. So think about that for a moment as you reflect back on the introduction. When you know that Sonic Records has had challenges in their own current market, which is why they want to expand into this new untested for them market. So your analysis is going to be the platform upon which you build a winning strategy for eSonic in this new market for them. So there's some issues to consider when you're thinking about your strategic analysis. So strategy evolves over a period of time. You're going to look at how small decisions when you're looking over an extended period of time and then balance those. So you're going to mitigate risks as you go. And so one of the biggest risks that you have as a consultant, especially one with a hat like you have today, is you really don't know the industry. And so your job is to make sure that you glean enough information from the research that you're going to conduct this week and beyond to ensure that when you're making recommendations, because that is what you will be doing in this class, when you make these recommendations, it will be done with the organization's objectives in mind. Okay? That's where the balance comes into place, and that's where your risk mitigation comes into place. Strategic risk analysis, while there's not necessarily a huge component of this in your project, it's important to remember that risk mitigation is important. Every time you put forth a compensation program or structure, or you do a job analysis, there's risk involved in that. You need to look at things from an internal and external perspective over both short and long term. Now, again, I don't expect you to do a full-blown risk analysis, but I do expect you to take that into consideration as you're making your recommendations. So, in the broad scheme of things, then, if you think of this as a continuum, where we're at right now is in the strategic thinking phase. We're looking at the external environment and the internal environment. And based on that information, we're going to figure out where does the company need to go. You know where they want to go, but what do they need to do in order to do it? So while they're going to look at their products, so what are their current products? How are they going to differ? You know that. That's what's in the introduction. The competitive situation. You'll analyze the main competitors. The distribution system. So are we going to change anything with respect to what Sonic Records does with what eSonic Records does? Environmental factors. You're going to analyze the internal and external environment. And then opportunities and issues analysis, so a SWOT analysis, will also be performed. So let's talk about methods of industry and competitive analysis. So where we're at now, if you're looking at your e-taxes, we're getting into the second component of the outline. Before I jump in there, let me talk about the outline on page 9, number 1, which is the executive summary. An executive summary is an overview. It gives a concise explanation of the key findings that you've discovered while researching eSonic's external environment and internal capabilities. So you're not going to write that first. You're not. You're going to put that aside until you have completed your analysis, and then you will finish your executive summary. The summary should be no more than 1 to 2 pages, but it should be specific enough and should have all the highlights of the key points that you've identified in your analysis. So let's jump into the strategic analysis itself. I've been talking many times now about the industry and understanding the industry. Well, one of the key components of the strategic analysis is you have to identify the industry. And what you're going to do that on is based on the North American Industrial Classification System, the NAICS. For whatever reason, most students seem to get bogged down in this code. Everyone wants to be right. So in other words, there is a bit of fear that if you choose the wrong code, somehow that will negate everything that you do. Well, it could. So let me give you some hints with respect to eSonic. You know that Sonic Records is in the recording industry and they manufacture CDs. That's your hint. eSonic, on the other hand, wants to break into the electronic music medium. That's your next hint. If you stay within those industry guidelines, music industry, former manufacturing of CDs and recording, and electronic medium for music, you'll be fine. But what I don't want you to do is to go off on a tangent and consider them a manufacturer or a retail environment, because they're not. The NAICS code is what you're going to use to leapfrog into your research of the industry. So if you're looking at 2B, number 1, the first thing you're going to do is an industry profile. And so that's why I've said if you look at Sonic Records as a record industry, which has a component of manufacturing CDs, who then in turn want to jump into the electronic music market, I think you've got a good platform with which to leap from to create your industry profile. So the industry profile itself is an assessment. On page 10, it walks you through some of the high level of what you're looking for. So on this particular slide, when you're doing an industry and competitive analysis, you want to look at industry traits, how intense competition might be, what's driving industry change. So is it consumer driven? Is it regulatory driven? Is it technologically driven, as an example? What's the market position? So in the introduction, you know that this market is heavily dominated by 2 competitors. What's the difficulty going to be for eSonic to break into that? What is the strategy of the rival companies? So if you look at this particular market, you're going to need to put a quote-unquote face with the name of a competitor. So let me give you an example. In this marketplace, there are many of them, but you could look at Spotify as an example. You could look at Apple as an example. Regardless of which one of those you choose, what's their strategy in this market? And how do you know? So again, it's important that as you do your analysis that you find information to back up your thoughts. So for example, it's not enough just to say that Apple is cutting edge. Well, how do you know they're cutting edge? What information can you find out there that tells you that? Specifically, if you're going to use Apple as an example, we don't care about the iPhone 5, the iPhone 6, the iPhone 7, 9, or 10 for that matter, in and of itself. But if the competitive advantage is because their platform seamlessly syncs to wherever your iTunes account might be, whether it's on your phone, your iPad, or in the cloud on a PC, if that's what their strategy is, then of course you're going to discuss it. But be sure that whatever you're using for your competitive analysis, it's relevant to the market in which eSonic is trying to break into. You're also going to want to look at their industry profit outlook. Now, you don't need to necessarily get into too many of the weeds, but you can find industry uh, information on places like Bloomberg.com. If it's a publicly traded company, you'll be able to find investor prospectus. And while that is light reading, and I say that tongue in cheek, you can find information about how much money these particular organizations are making and how efficient they are in their operations. Again, I give you these resources not to say you must go out and do it. It's an example of a resource that you can pull to be able to help you with your analysis. Okay. So when you're thinking strategically about investing into a company, you look into a variety of things. So what are the dominant economic features of the industry? So this is a great bullet point for you to look at when you're going through your industry profile and your competitive analysis. What's the nature and strength of the competition? What are the triggers of change? So what's caused the industry to change in the first place? What are the likely triggers to cause change in the future? Who are the strongest? Who are in the weakest positions with respect to this competitive market? What are the likely moves of the rivals? So is there anything that you can see in your research that says that whomever you've identified as a competitor, and again, I'd suggest you identify at least 2 competitors for this analysis, what are they likely going to do in the market? Is it going to be status quo? Are they on the bleeding edge of technology somewhere? How do you know? And then what are the key factors of competitive success? Now, you can identify those factors fairly easily by looking at what made the competition successful. Can you replicate it? If so, do you know how to do that? So think about that, because the quote-unquote do you know how to do that, or what do you need to do to achieve that, is what's going to come in subsequent milestones. And what are the prospects and financial attractiveness of the industry? So what does that mean? What that means is, are investors going to continue to invest in this type of an industry? Are consumers going to flock to it? So the dominant economic features of the industry, so what's the market size and growth rate? What's the scope of the rivalry? How many competitors are in this industry and relative sizes? These are all things to consider. You're not necessarily going to address every single one of these in your analysis, but it is important for you to think about these things. What are the barriers to entrance? So how hard is it to get into this market? What's the industry's profitability look like? What are the product and customer characteristics of folks who use this type of industry? When you think about your competition, so what kind of competition is it? Is it fierce, cutthroat? What's the product quality? What's the cooperation like with customers? What about other competitors? What are your product features? All of these things are things to consider. Again, you're not going to take this slide as a bullet point and address every single piece in your competitive analysis. This is food for thought for you to help drive your research as you choose who you're going to analyze. So triggers for change, we mentioned that a little earlier. Industries change because there are forces driving participants to alter their actions. What are the internet and e-commerce opportunities? That one's going to stand out here. What regulations are on the horizon that might limit the ability of these companies to do what they do? Are there pending legislation? Is there pending legal implications out there? Strongest and weakest points, again, is everyone integrated? Do they emphasize the same type of distribution channel? Are buyers buying in similar services? Do they use technological approaches that are identical? Things like that to consider. When you're thinking about the firm's strategic moves, and again, this is going back to the introduction, when you're thinking about what you're reading about the company's goals are, the firm's strategic moves are affected by current strategies of the competition and the future actions of the competition. Profiling key rivals means getting competitive intelligence about their strategies, their moves, their strengths, their weaknesses, their announced plans. So Coke versus Pepsi, how they stay relevant is making sure they know what the other is doing. So what does eSonic need to do? What competitive intelligence can you glean on 1 to 2 competitors in that market to assist them? Predicting the next move, well, it's like I said earlier, how do you know that the competition is going to move in a certain direction? What evidence can you find to support that? There will be public announcements. There will be industry speculation, things like that. You might even be able to look at what past leadership has done if you're going into in-depth. Now, for the purpose of this analysis, you don't need to write a dissertation about your competition, but you should understand, if you are looking at a company like Spotify, what the CEO has done in the past. What has their business practice been? What have you heard on the street about what that platform is doing going forward, etc., etc. You can conduct a SWOT analysis. They look like this. It's not necessary to put a SWOT analysis or a PEST analysis in this particular strategic analysis. However, what I found about this particular slide was that it helped hone in, again, more questions to ask as you're doing your research. I don't expect you to have this in your analysis, but I do expect you to be able to understand what the opportunities and threats are, especially when you start to talk about the internal consistency in the next modules. So from here, we're still in section B, talking about, we've finished the industry profile, we've talked about the competition, talking about the long-term prospects report. Again, you can look at industry information. Again, Bureau of Labor and Statistics goes a long way, but you can also look at outside sources like Bloomberg.com or CNN Financial, or one of the financial sources that are out there. And then you've got to talk about the labor market. So if you're looking at the BLS, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics Occupational Outlook Handbook, it's good for projecting long-term employment supply, but I would also recommend that you not only look at the BLS, but you look at other outside sources that specifically address this particular labor market, and there are plenty of resources out there to help you with that. Okay, so let's talk about internal capabilities. So move away from the slide that's on the screen at the moment. We're in part C of the strategic analysis now, where you're going to do a functional capabilities assessment. And if you're following along, that's on page 11. And so the functional capabilities are listed here: manufacturing, engineering, research and development, operations, management information systems, so in other words IT, HR, and marketing. So your consulting team should consider what capabilities will prove most crucial to eSonic's success. So in this section, you're not necessarily telling me whether or not HR is a great department or not. You're telling me whether HR is going to be critical for eSonic's success. And you're going to tell me why you think that it would be that way, and you're going to need to be able to cite evidence to support that. And the reason for that is once you identify the critical internal functional capabilities that are needed, you're going to be able to turn that around and focus your Milestone 2 project when you start building an internal consistency framework for compensation. Now, when you get into C2, which is your HR capabilities, you're going to highlight the strengths and weaknesses of eSonic's labor force, but also focus upon future recruitment and retention strategies. So when you're looking at your competitive analysis, one of the things you should also be looking at is what are the human capital capabilities of these competitors? Who are they recruiting? Who are they attracting? How do you know that? And are those the same individuals that then eSonic is going to be competing for? And if they are, does your HR team, what gaps in compensation, in recruitment, in talent management, talent rewards, retention, what are the gaps that you can identify in your strategic analysis? And again, you're going to get some of that from the introduction, but you're also going to glean some of that from what we've already discussed over the last 5-6 chapters in the book, in addition to what you're going to be reading for this week. All of that information that Mark Tokyo talks about, in addition to any of the lectures that we've talked about or case studies that you've read about, etc., etc. All of that information is going to help you identify, look, if the competition is looking for example, IT programmers, and I know from my research that that market is a cooling market, still sought after in some respects, but not nearly as hot as information security, as an example, then your recruiting and retention strategies might be very different if you're looking for a programmer versus if you are looking for someone who is in IT security. You may decide that the information management system team is more important, so more crucial to eSonic's success than, for example, your manufacturing side, because you may not have anything that you need to manufacture. So when you're putting your compensation structure together, you're going to put your structure together in Milestone 2 and 3 with that in mind. So again, Milestone 1 really is about creating your guidepost for completing your next 2 milestones. Okay, if you have any questions about the milestone as we go through these, just please send me an email. It's the quickest way to get a hold of me rather than using the general discussions or the general questions discussion board area. If there's something that I see that comes up over multiple questions, I'll make sure to post them. But please make sure you're reviewing the project in its entirety so you can see from end to end what is expected, because eventually you will pull all of these together. Make sure you not only look at the strategic analysis, but make sure you take a look at the appendices too in your compensation project e-text. Be sure to do your research and make sure to have a reference page and internal citations. And by internal citations, I mean in-text citations. I can't stress enough that there needs to be evidence to support your direction. And based on the rubric, you'll be graded accordingly. Now, I will also say that if there is ever a conflict between the rubric, what the rubric says, and what the Building a Strategic Compensation Systems Project e-text says, the rubric wins out. All right, so the rubric is your guide, and then you get more detail here in the e-text. All right, everyone, have a wonderful week. I'll be posting additional information throughout the week about strategy, SWOT analyses, etc., in addition to some conversation about the texts from this week.